He was selected with the second overall pick in the draft. Only Tim Duncan went ahead of him. He immediately averaged about 20 points per game and looked like a future superstar. He reached the NBA Finals alongside Allen Iverson. But then, the player once considered the future face of the league gradually lost his status. What went wrong? Why did Keith Van Horn's career fall so far short of the future that was predicted for him? And why is the name of one of the most exciting young players of his time so rarely remembered today? Watch through to the end. The finale of his story will make you look at his entire career in a completely different light. If you enjoy, just like I do, discovering the real stories behind NBA legends, their incredible highs, tragic downfalls, and the little-known facts that are rarely talked about today, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps the channel grow and makes new videos possible. Thank you. Now, let's continue. In 1997, a player entered the NBA whom many considered a future superstar. His name was Keith Van Horn. He was just 22 years old. He possessed a rare combination of size, skill, and shooting for a tall forward. At about 6 feet 10 inches, Van Horn could attack from beyond the arc, confidently score on drives, and create problems for defenders who were used to guarding slower big men. But that was not even the main thing. At the University of Utah, he had already turned into a true star. Van Horn became one of the most productive players in college basketball and led his team to a high level. He was called one of the most promising basketball players of his generation. Then came the draft. The New Jersey Nets selected Van Horn with the second pick. Only Tim Duncan went before him. And this circumstance is especially interesting today, because back then, it seemed that the NBA was getting two future faces of the league at once. Duncan would indeed become a legend, and Van Horn was supposed to become his rival among the young stars. For New Jersey, this was a huge opportunity. The team got a tall, young, and already ready for a serious role player. They did not need him to sit on the bench for years and wait for his time. His time had already come. And the first months in the NBA only strengthened those expectations. Van Horn immediately received a huge role on offense. He did not look like a lost rookie having to adjust to the speed of professional basketball. He scored points, grabbed rebounds, and became one of the main players on his team. In his first season, he averaged about 20 points per game and nearly 8 rebounds. For a rookie, that was a very serious result. He was named to the all-rookie first team, and suddenly, everything looked almost perfect. A young player was already showing the level of a seasoned veteran. The team could build its future around him. Fans saw promise. Experts talked about his potential. It seemed things would only get better from there. But this is exactly where the story begins that turned out to be not at all what people imagined in 1997. Because averaging 20 points per game is one thing, but turning into a player who leads a team to the pinnacle of the NBA is something completely different. Van Horn had to prove he was capable of taking that next step. And at first, it seemed he actually would. In the following seasons, he continued to be one of the main players for the New Jersey Nets. His shooting became an important part of the offense, and his height allowed him to combine perimeter play with work around the basket. He did not disappear after a bright debut. He did not turn out to be a flash in the pan. Van Horn continued to consistently bring his team points and rebounds. The problem lay elsewhere. The Nets were not turning into championship contenders. The team could show individual successful stretches, but they lacked consistency. Teammates changed, coaches changed, and the very structure of the team changed. And Van Horn increasingly found himself in a situation where his individual numbers looked convincing, but the team's overall results remained far more modest than expected. This gradually became the main question. If the player is that talented, why is the team around him not rising to the next level? The answer turned out to be more complicated than just numbers in a box score. Van Horn was good at almost everything, But he never developed that one quality that usually separates a solid player from a true franchise leader. He did not become the man around whom an entire organization could build a championship system. And while New Jersey was looking for a solution, another talented player appeared in the lineup, Stephon Marbury. His arrival changed the balance within the team. Now, attention was no longer divided only between Van Horn and the other players. The Nets now had another bright young basketball player who could lay claim to a central role.
For Van Horn, this was a turning point. Not so long ago, he was seen as the main future project. Now the team was starting to move in a different direction. And soon it became clear just how far this process would go. Van Horn left New Jersey. He was sent to the Philadelphia 76ers in a major trade. And right there, fate seemed to give him one more chance. A new team, a new city, a new system, and most importantly, a chance to prove that the problems of the early years were not only about him. In Philadelphia, he found himself alongside a player who was gradually turning into one of the most recognizable basketball players of his generation, Allen Iverson. If Van Horn represented a tall, skilled forward with a good shot, Iverson was a completely different phenomenon. He played with incredible speed, constantly attacked the defense, and was already becoming the central figure of the entire team. Van Horn did not need to become the main player. He needed to become the ideal partner. And for a while, this combination actually worked. Philadelphia had a standout season. The team reached the NBA Finals, and Van Horn found himself just a few steps away from the main goal of his career. But here a new paradox emerged. The player who was once envisioned as the future face of a franchise was now part of a team built around another leader. And perhaps this is the best way to describe Keith Van Horn's entire career. He was constantly close to great success, but he was almost never its main author. Philadelphia made it to the finals, but they could not win the championship. After that, the roster began to change again, and along with it, Van Horn's role changed as well. His career continued. He was still a useful player. He could still score, hit from beyond the arc, and use his physical advantages. But the old feeling of a future superstar was gone. And soon, another twist appeared. Van Horn ended up with the New York Knicks.
For any basketball player, that is a huge stage. Madison Square Garden, a massive audience, constant media attention. But with that, the demands also increased. In New York, they no longer expected him to become the league's next leader. They expected results right now. And here, a troubling trend gradually emerged. His role diminished. His stats declined. He increasingly became part of the overall structure rather than its central figure. Once, people followed his performances as the career of a future star. Now, his moves between teams became a routine part of the league. Milwaukee Bucks, Dallas Mavericks, new teammates, new coaches, new tasks. Van Horn kept playing in the NBA, but his story gradually turned from that of a rising star into that of a veteran trying to find his place in a rotation. And yet, the most interesting part awaited him at the very end. With the Dallas Mavericks, Van Horn found himself on a team that reached the NBA Finals in the 2005-06 season.
Just think about it. Once he was the young player around whom the Nets wanted to build the future. Now he was in the finals, almost 10 years after his arrival in the league. But the role was completely different. This was no longer the Keith Van Horn who was drafted second overall. He had become a veteran, an experienced player, a guy who could help a team with depth and shooting, but no longer determined its fate. Dallas lost the final series to the Miami Heat, and soon Van Horn's NBA career came to an end. And in this finale, there is an almost symbolic detail. He managed to see both sides of professional basketball. At the start of his career, he was greeted as one of the league's top young talents. At the end, he found himself near a championship chase in a completely different role. Between those 2 points, less than 10 years passed. But in that time, almost everything changed. Keith Van Horn was not a bad player, And that is exactly why his story is so interesting.
He had a strong career. He was a notable star of his generation. He scored in large volumes, played in the NBA Finals, and remained an in-demand professional for many years. But that was not enough for the image that had been built around him at the beginning of his journey. Because the second overall pick is always evaluated not only by how many points he scored, he is compared to those he was supposed to surpass. To those who became legends, to those whose names still echo in conversations about great players decades later. And here lies the main paradox of Keith Van Horn. He turned out to be good enough to become a star, but his career never reached the level that his start promised. He did not disappear from the NBA after a few seasons. He did not turn out to be a failure. On the contrary, he lasted a long time. But the longer his career went on, the more the gap grew between the original expectations and reality. In 1997, his name sounded like the name of a future leader.
A few years later, he was already part of other people's projects, and by the end of his career, he was a veteran who helped his team, but no longer determined its direction. And perhaps that is exactly why he is remembered much less often today than one might have expected after his debut. He ended up in a very unusual category of basketball players. Not a bust, not a legend, not a one-season wonder, but a player who truly had enormous talent and truly achieved a lot, yet could never turn that talent into the career that was predicted for him. And if you go back to that evening when the New Jersey Nets picked him second overall, it becomes especially interesting to imagine what the fans were thinking then. In front of them stood a young, tall forward with a great shot. He had just proven his worth in college. He started his professional career brilliantly. He still had so much ahead of him. But no one back then could have known that years later, the main question would not be how great he would become, but why he never became the player they envisioned. Keith Van Horn got his chance. He got the talent. He got his place in the NBA. He got the opportunity to play in the finals, but history had other plans. And perhaps the strangest thing about his career is that even after all of this, he still remained a player about whom you can say one simple thing. He was much closer to greatness than we tend to remember today. If you are interested in other real stories of forgotten stars and dramatic fates of NBA players, be sure to watch other videos on our channel. Links to the most interesting stories will appear on screen right now.